22,000 feet above enemy lines, the world had gone quiet. Not peaceful quiet. The kind of silence that comes right before everything ends. Franz Stigler could feel it in his bones, in the way his Messerschmitt's engine coughed like a dying man, sputtering and gasping for fuel that simply wasn't there anymore. The needle on his gauge kissed empty, then dropped below it, into that red zone every pilot fears. March 24, 1945. Somewhere over the German countryside near Kosovo, and Oberleutnant Franz Stigler knew with absolute certainty that he was about to die. Below him, 50 miles of American-held territory stretched out like a hostile ocean. Every field and village crawling with enemy troops who'd spent months clawing their way across Europe. Behind him, his own airfield sat unreachable, too far for a plane running on fumes and prayers. All around him, the sky belonged to them now, to the Americans. To their endless waves of fighters and bombers that blackened the horizon every single day. Franz's hands shook on the stick, trembling not from the brutal cold that bit through his flight suit at this altitude, but from something deeper, something primal, fear. He'd heard the stories every Luftwaffe pilot had, whispered in ready rooms and shouted over schnapps and officers' clubs. The Americans don't just shoot you down, they hunt you in your parachute. They circle overhead like vultures while you dangle their helpless. Swinging in the wind, an easy target practice for men who've forgotten mercy. His commander's words echoed in his skull. The Americans are savages, they show no quarter to German pilots. If you bail out over their territory, you're already dead. Better to go down with your plane than face what they'll do to you on the ground. Franz stared down through the scratched canopy at the patchwork landscape below. Somewhere down there were Sherman tanks and rifle companies. GI's Hood watched their buddies die, who'd seen burning cities and broken bodies. Men with every reason in the world to hate him, to hate everything he represented. The engine coughed again, a wet rattling sound that turned his stomach. And this time it didn't recover. The propeller windmilled uselessly. Just a big metal fan spinning in the slipstream. No power, no thrust, nothing. Dead stick. The phrase every pilot dreads. He was gliding now. It's nothing but 30 feet of wingspan and the cold mathematics of gravity deciding how long he had left. An American airfield appeared ahead, one of their bases. Probably a captured Luftwaffe strip now swarming with enemy aircraft, rows of silver fighters gleaming in the afternoon sun. 2 minutes, maybe less, before he'd have to make the choice. Bail out and take his chances with the parachute killers. Or try a forced landing and pray the crash didn't turn him into a fireball. His mind went to Bavaria. To his mother's face, to his younger sister, who still believed he was invincible. They'd get a telegram missing in action. 3 words that meant nothing and everything. They'd never know if he burned alive or was shot out of the sky or beaten to death by angry soldiers on the ground. They'd just know he never came home. Then his mirror caught them, 2 silver specks growing larger by the second, closing fast with that predatory speed that makes your mouth go dry. P-51 Mustangs, the Americans' best. It's the most lethal fighters in the European sky, sleek and fast and absolutely deadly. Franz's throat constricted. This was it then, the end. They'd blow him apart before he could even pop the canopy. At least it would be quick. At least he wouldn't feel the bullets tearing through his parachute silk. But then something happened that made no sense at all. Something that would crack open everything he thought he knew about Americans, about enemies, about this war. The lead Mustang didn't open fire. Instead, it pulled alongside, dangerously close, maybe 50 feet off his wingtip, close enough that Franz could see every rivet on its fuselage, close enough to see the pilot's face through the canopy glass, a young face, probably mid-20s like him, an American face that wasn't twisted with rage or hatred. The pilot wasn't reaching for his gun trigger. His hand wasn't moving toward the weapons panel. Instead, he was looking directly at Franz, making eye contact across the void, human to human. And then he did something that Franz's brain couldn't process. The American pointed down, not aggressively, not like a threat, almost gently, pointing toward the airfield below like he was offering directions to a lost traveler. Franz stared, his mind racing. Was this some kind of sick game? Some new form of psychological torture before they finished him off? The second Mustang slid into position on his other wing. Now he was boxed in. American fighters on both sides, escorting him like what? Like he was one of their own damaged birds limping home. His altimeter unwound through 18,000 feet. The Messerschmitt gliding down in that eerie silence that comes when the engine dies. Just the whisper of wind over the wings and the hammering of his own heart in his ears. The lead pilot pointed down again, more insistent this time, then made a gesture with his palms, pushing down, slow down, easy land. Franz's world tilted. They were helping him. These American pilots who should be killing him were escorting him to an emergency landing. Nothing in his training. Nothing in 4 years of propaganda and briefings and commander's speeches had prepared him for this moment. 15,000 feet, the airfield growing larger in his windscreen, he could make out individual aircraft now. Parked in neat rows, ground crews moving between them. If he landed there, he'd be captured. A prisoner of war, at the mercy of the Americans. Every propaganda film he'd ever been forced to watch flashed through his mind. Torture chambers, execution walls. Prisoners worked to death in frozen labor camps. His commander had been clear. Better to die fighting than to surrender to the American beasts. But his options had run out. The ground was coming up fast, and the American pilots stayed with him. One on each wing like guardian angels in enemy colors. Through 10,000 feet? 8,000? 5,000? Franz's hands were slick with sweat inside his leather gloves. His heart threatened to break through his ribs. He kept waiting for the burst of machine gun fire that would shred his aircraft into confetti. It never came. At 3,000 feet, the lead American rocked his wings. A signal, then peeled off gracefully. Giving Franz room to maneuver for the runway, the second Mustang stayed close, herding him gently toward the concrete strip like a sheepdog guiding a lost lamb home. Franz cranked down his landing gear manually. The hydraulics were useless without engine power. The wheels locked into place with a mechanical thunk that he felt more than heard. He lined up on the runway, fighting the controls of his dead aircraft. Using every hour of training to stretch the glide, to judge the approach, to bring this dying machine down in one piece, the American fighter stayed with him until he was 50 feet off the deck, then pulled up sharply and away, its engine roaring as it climbed back into the sky. Franz's wheels kissed concrete. The Messerschmitt bounced once. Hard, then settled and rolled. He had no brakes. No hydraulic pressure to slow the aircraft. It rolled and rolled, eating up runway, finally shuddering to a stop at the far end. Exhaust and burnt rubber smell filling the cockpit. For a long moment, Franz just sat there, hands still frozen on the stick. Breathing hard, alive, impossibly alive. Then he saw the jeeps racing toward him across the tarmac. American soldiers. This was it, the moment of capture. The moment when he'd find out if the propaganda was true or if what, he didn't know. He thought about his sidearm. About making some kind of last stand. Dying like a German officer should, but something stopped him. Those American pilots had just saved his life. They could have killed him, so icily. Instead, they'd shepherded him down like he mattered, like his life had value. Franz unbuckled his harness with numb fingers, pushed open the canopy, and raised his hands high above his head. The first American to reach him was a sergeant, nameplate Red Hayes, Oklahoma written in his accent. He climbed up onto the wing, pistol drawn but pointed at the ground, not at Franz's chest. Out, the sergeant said in English, then in broken, almost comical German, "Raus langsam, slowly." Franz climbed out on shaking legs, 3 hours in the cockpit. 3 hours of fear and adrenaline, his flight suit soaked through with cold sweat despite the freezing altitude. He stood on the wing, hands raised, waiting for the blow. The rifle, but the rough hands. The violence he'd been promised. Hayes holstered his pistol, actually holstered it, then reached out and steadied Franz as he climbed down. "Easy there, buddy," the sergeant said. "You okay, Verletztinjured?" Franz stared at him. This American sergeant was checking on him, asking if he was hurt. Genuine concern in his voice. Not anger, not hatred, concern. 9, Franz managed, his voice barely working. "Not injured?" "Good," Hayes said, like it actually mattered to him. "Come on then," gesturing toward the jeep, casual, almost friendly, like Franz was a visiting pilot who'd made an unscheduled stop. Not an enemy who'd been bombing Allied positions for years. In the jeep, Franz sat between 2 American soldiers. Neither one pointed a weapon at him, they just sat there. Ordinary men in olive drab uniforms that smelled of cigarette smoke and coffee. Human smells, normal smells. One of them unscrewed a canteen and offered it to Franz. Franz hesitated. Was this a trick? Some kind of test? But his throat was sandpaper dry. He took the canteen. The water was cold and clean, possibly the best thing he'd ever tasted in his life. Danke, he said quietly. The soldier grinned, actually grinned. You're welcome, pal. They brought him to the base operations building. Into warmth, out of the March wind that cut like a knife. An intelligence officer was waiting. Captain James Mitchell, his nameplate read. He spoke perfect German. His accent was educated, almost scholarly. Sit down, Mitchell said in German, pointing to a chair. Not a hard interrogation chair, but a comfortable office chair. And there was coffee on the desk. Real coffee. The smell of it made Franz's head swim. He hadn't smelled real coffee in months. You want some? Mitchell asked, already pouring, not waiting for an answer. Franz nodded, not trusting his voice. Mitchell handed him the cup. Hot, black, with 2 sugar cubes on the saucer. Sugar. Real sugar. Germany was starving. Everything was rationed to nothing. And here the Americans were giving sugar to an enemy prisoner. Those were good pilots who brought you in, Mitchell said conversationally. Sitting down across from Franz like they were colleagues, Captain Joe Henderson and Lieutenant Charlie Brennan, 357th Fighter Group, they saw your engine was gone and figured you might want to live through the day. Franz sipped the coffee. It burned his tongue. He didn't care. The taste was heaven. The warmth spread through his chest like a small sun. Why? The word escaped before he could stop it, before he could think. Mitchell looked at him curiously. Why? What? Why didn't they shoot me down? Why did they help me? Franz asked the question that was tearing his mind apart. Mitchell seemed genuinely puzzled, like the answer was obvious, because you were defenseless. What kind of men do you think we are? Over the next hour, everything Franz had been taught, everything he'd believed about Americans, began to crumble like a sandcastle hit by waves. They took him to the prisoner holding area, not a cage, not a cell with bars, but a converted barracks building with actual bunks, wool blankets, and a working stove that radiated blessed heat. There were a dozen other German prisoners there, all recently captured, all wearing the same stunned expression Franz could feel on his own face. Like they'd stepped through a mirror into some alternate reality. An American medic examined him, even though Franz insisted he was fine. The medic checked his blood pressure, peered into his eyes with a small light, listened to his heart through a cold stethoscope. You're dehydrated, the medic said through an interpreter. And you've got frostbite starting on your fingers. We'll get you fixed up. They gave him ointment for his hands, another wool blanket, and an American ration pack. Canned meat, crackers, chocolate, cigarettes. The chocolate was dark and rich and tasted like childhood. Like Christmases before the war, Franz ate it slowly, making it last. Savoring every bite like it might be his last. That evening, Captain Henderson came to visit, the pilot who'd escorted him down, who'd saved his life. He brought cigarettes and a thermos of hot soup. Thought you might be hungry? Henderson said through the interpreter. His smile was easy, genuine. That was some nice flying, by the way. Dead stick landing in a 109 on an unfamiliar runway. Impressive. Franz didn't know how to respond. This American pilot, his enemy, was complimenting his flying skills. They'd been trying to kill each other for years, and now Henderson was treating him like a colleague who'd had some bad luck. Henderson pulled out a photograph from his wallet, worn at the edges from handling a pretty woman with 2 small children. My wife Betty and my kids, he said, pride softening his voice. Donna's 5. Little Joe just turned 3. You got family. Franz nodded slowly, his throat tight. My mother. My sister. They'll be glad to know you made it down safe, Henderson said. Red Cross will notify them. You're a prisoner of war now. That's better than missing in action, right? They sat in silence for a moment, 2 fighter pilots on opposite sides of a war, looking at family photos in the dim light of a prisoner barracks. Just 2 men who wanted to go home. Listen, Henderson said finally, leaning forward, I know what they told you about us. Probably said we'd torture you, shoot prisoners, all that garbage. But that's not who we are. You're going to be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You'll get medical care, food, male privileges, and when this war is over, and it will be over soon, you'll go home to your family. Franz felt something break inside him. Not break exactly, crack open, like ice thawing after a long winter. In Germany, he said carefully in broken English. They tell us Americans are animals, Henderson laughed. But there was no cruelty in it. Yeah, well, they told us you guys eat babies for breakfast. Propaganda's a hell of a thing, isn't it? Over the next 3 weeks at the temporary prisoner camp, Franz witnessed something that challenged every belief he'd held about America and Americans. The food was adequate, not luxurious, but consistent. Rations, powdered eggs, canned meat, the same food American soldiers ate. When Red Cross parcels arrived, prisoners got first pick. Chocolate, cigarettes, coffee, soap, little luxuries that felt like miracles to men who'd been surviving on wartime rations for years. Medical care was provided without hesitation. One of the German prisoners, a young pilot named Werner, had been shot in the leg before capture. The bullet was still in there, infected, turning the flesh around it gray. The American doctors treated him exactly like they treated their own wounded. Sulfa drugs, clean bandages, surgery to remove the bullet and drain the infection. Werner walked with a limp afterward, but he walked. In a German prisoner camp, he probably would have lost the leg, probably would have died. Franz watched the American guards carefully, waiting for the mask to slip, for the cruelty to emerge. It never did. They were professional, sometimes bored, occasionally friendly. One guard, a kid from Nebraska named Tommy, who couldn't have been more than 19, taught Franz American baseball terms, strikes and balls and home runs. Franz taught Tommy some German curse words, the inappropriate ones that made Tommy laugh until he cried. They laughed together, enemy and captor, just two young men killing time. The prisoners were allowed to write letters home. Censored, obviously, but allowed. The Red Cross facilitated it. Made sure the letters actually got sent. Franz wrote to his mother, telling her he was alive, uninjured, being treated well. He didn't know if she'd believe him. Didn't know if the letter would even reach Bavaria through the chaos of Germany's collapse. Franz began to understand something fundamental, something that shifted his entire worldview. The Americans weren't being kind out of weakness or naivete. They were being decent because they believed in something, in rules, in the Geneva Convention, in treating prisoners humanely even while their own soldiers were dying on the front lines. It wasn't softness, it was strength. It took real strength to treat your enemies with dignity when you had every reason to hate them. One afternoon in early April, Franz was sitting outside the barracks. They were allowed to move around the compound freely during daylight. When he heard music drifting across the yard, American music, someone had set up a radio and Glenn Miller's orchestra was playing in the mood. That infectious swing rhythm that made your foot tap whether you wanted it to or not. Franz found himself moving to the beat. He'd loved swing music before the war. Before it was banned as degenerate American culture. Before everything joyful was labeled as enemy propaganda. One of the guards noticed him. "You like swing?" the guard asked. Franz nodded. "Before the war, I listened to it. Yes." "No kidding." "Hold on." The guard disappeared into one of the buildings and came back carrying a record player and a small stack of 78 RPM records. Benny Goodman, Duke Ellington, Artie Shaw. He set it up in the barracks common room. "There you go," the guard said. "Enjoy." That night, German prisoners and American guards sat in the same room listening to jazz, tapping their feet to the same rhythm. The war hadn't ended. Men were still dying just miles away, but in that moment they were just people who liked music. Just human beings who could appreciate something beautiful together. Another incident stuck with Franz. A new prisoner arrived. A Luftwaffe pilot named Klaus who'd been badly burned when his fighter was hit. His hands were wrapped in thick bandages. His face scarred with angry red tissue. He was bitter, angry, still full of Nazi propaganda and hatred. "They'll kill us all eventually," Klaus said darkly in German. "They're just fattening us up first, making us soft before the slaughter." Franz shook his head. "No, they won't. They're not like that." "You've been brainwashed," Klaus spat. "I've been treated like a human being," Franz corrected quietly. Maybe for the first time in 5 years. Klaus didn't believe him. Not at first. Not until the American doctor spent weeks treating his burns, changing his bandages daily with gentle hands, giving him morphine for the pain when the nights got bad. Not until an American nurse with kind eyes sat with him during the worst hours when the pain was unbearable, just talking to him in broken German to distract him from the agony, telling him about her hometown in Ohio, about her younger brother who was also fighting somewhere in Europe, Klaus's hatred crumbled slowly, like a fortress being undermined from within, brick by brick. Perhaps the most powerful moment came 3 days before Germany's final surrender. Captain Mitchell, the intelligence officer, gathered all the prisoners together in the common room. His face was serious but not unkind. "The war is almost over," he said in German. "You'll be going home soon, but I want you to understand something. When you get home, Germany is going to need rebuilding. It's going to need men who understand that the Nazi way was wrong, who can help build something better. I hope you'll be those men." Franz realized then that the Americans weren't just winning the war. They were thinking about the peace, about what came after, about rebuilding their enemies into allies. It was a longer vision than any German general had ever shown, a strategy that looked beyond victory to what victory could create. The treatment Franz received wasn't accidental, it wasn't even exceptional. It was American military policy flowing from the very top. General Eisenhower had made it crystal clear. Prisoners of war would be treated according to the Geneva Convention, period. No exceptions. Not because German prisoner camps did the same, they often didn't. But because Americans believed in a code that transcended the immediate brutality of war. This wasn't Navit, it was strategy, brilliant long-term strategy. American leadership understood that how you treat defeated enemies determines what kind of peace you can build. Every well-treated German prisoner was a potential ally in the reconstruction. Every act of American decency was a counterweight to Nazi propaganda. A living example that everything they'd been told was a lie. The numbers tell the story better than words. Of the approximately 380,000 German prisoners held in the United States during World War II, the survival rate was over 99%. In German prisoner camps holding Soviet soldiers, the survival rate was around 40%. In Japanese camps, it was even worse. This wasn't because Americans were soft. American soldiers died by the thousands liberating Europe. They saw the concentration camps, they had every reason to hate. But they followed a different code. It came from American culture, from the Declaration of Independence, from the Constitution, from the belief that even enemies have rights, that the rules apply even in war, that how you fight matters as much as whether you win. This was revolutionary thinking in a world that had seen total war consume entire continents. Franz kept a diary during his captivity. It's preserved now in a German military archive. The entries chart his transformation from true believer to questioning skeptic to someone who'd seen a different way. March 24th, captured by Americans, expected death. Received coffee and blankets instead. Cannot understand this. Nothing makes sense. March 30th, the guards treat us like soldiers, not animals. One shared his cigarettes with me. His name is Tommy. He has a farm in Nebraska. He showed me pictures. We laughed together. April 10th, we listened to American music tonight, jazz and swing. I'd forgotten what it felt like to simply be young, to enjoy something beautiful. The war seems very far away right now. April 12th, Germany has surrendered. We will go home soon. I don't know what I'll find there, but I know now that everything they told us about the Americans was a lie. They're not monsters. They're men who believe in something larger than themselves. Something worth fighting for beyond just winning. Decades later in interviews, Franz would say, "Those American pilots saved my life twice. Once when they escorted me down, and once when they showed me that not all of humanity had been consumed by the war. They gave me hope that the world could be better." He wasn't alone. Thousands of German prisoners came home with similar stories. Stories that spread through the ruins of Germany like seeds. In the years after the war, they became voices for reconciliation, for democracy, for building bridges between former enemies instead of nursing grudges. Between 1943 and 1945, American forces captured approximately 3.8 million German soldiers. The vast majority were treated according to Geneva Convention standards. Prisoner camps in the United States even offered educational programs. German prisoners could take classes, learn trades, prepare for life after the war. They weren't just being held, they were being prepared to rebuild their country. Compare this to the Eastern Front, where Soviet and German forces fought with apocalyptic brutality, where surrender meant death or worse, or the Pacific Theater, where surrender was often not an option on either side. The difference wasn't just moral, it was strategic. By 1946, the United States was already thinking about the Cold War, about building Western Europe into a bulwark against Soviet expansion. Germany, West Germany specifically, needed to be an ally, not a defeated enemy, nursing grievances and dreaming of revenge. Every German prisoner who came home saying the Americans treated me fairly was a brick in that foundation. A voice countering the communist propaganda. A living example that democracy and decency weren't just propaganda terms, but real values that guided real actions. Franz Stigler was repatriated to Germany in August 19. He found his mother and sister alive in Bavaria, living in a half-destroyed house, but alive, breathing, waiting for him. His father had died on the Eastern Front. Just another name on the endless lists. His hometown was rubble, streets he'd walked as a child reduced to broken bricks and memories. He used his skills as a pilot to work for a commercial airline in the 1950s, flying for Lufthansa as Germany rebuilt itself from the ashes. He never forgot those 3 weeks as a prisoner. Never forgot the American pilots who'd saved his life. Captain Henderson's face stayed clear in his memory when so much else faded. In 1961, Franz immigrated to Canada, started a business, raised a family, lived a long, peaceful life. But he never stopped thinking about that moment at 22,000 feet when the American Mustangs pulled alongside his dying aircraft, when they could have killed him, but chose to save him instead. That choice haunted him in the best possible way. He tried for years to find Captain Joe Henderson, the pilot who'd escorted him down. He wrote letters to American veteran organizations, posted inquiries in military journals, searched. Finally, in 1989, they connected. Henderson was retired. Living in Florida, enjoying the sunshine, they arranged to meet. When Franz saw Henderson for the first time in 44 years, he wept. Two old men, former enemies, embracing in an airport terminal while travelers rushed past, oblivious to the history unfolding in front of them. "Thank you," Franz said, his voice breaking. "Thank you for giving me my life." Henderson, characteristically modest, just shrugged. "It was the right thing to do," he said simply, like it was that easy. Like choosing mercy over revenge was just common sense. They remained friends until Henderson's death in 2001. Franz spoke at his funeral, standing in a Florida chapel. Telling the story of the day, an enemy became a wingman, a captor became a savior, and propaganda crumbled in the face of simple human decency. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Franz's story was one of thousands, tens of thousands, but the cumulative effect was profound, world-changing. By treating prisoners humanely, America didn't just win the war, it won the peace. The Marshall Plan, which rebuilt Western Europe, only worked because Germans were willing to accept American help. And they were willing because their experience with Americans, even as enemies, had shown them that America could be trusted. West Germany became a crucial Cold War ally, a democracy, an economic powerhouse, a partner, not a defeated foe, nursing resentment and plotting revenge. Japan followed a similar path, Italy too. The Axis powers of 1945 became the democratic allies of 1955. That transformation didn't happen automatically. It didn't happen by accident. It happened because American policy from the infantry squad level all the way up to the Pentagon emphasized treating enemies with a baseline of human dignity. It was strategic brilliance disguised as simple decency. It was understanding that the war you're fighting today determines the peace you'll have tomorrow. In a 1995 interview, Franz reflected on what that experience taught him. What it meant? "I learned that propaganda is a poison," he said. "Both sides told lies about each other, but the difference was, when I met Americans face to face, their actions contradicted their propaganda. They showed me through their behavior that human beings could choose to be decent even in the midst of terrible war. That choice. That's what separates civilization from barbarism." Franz's children and grandchildren grew up hearing the story. It became part of their family history, their identity. His grandson became a German Air Force pilot and later served alongside American pilots in NATO exercises. Flying together, training together, the cycle had come full circle. Enemies to captors, to allies, to partners, all because some American pilots chose mercy over revenge on a cold March day in 19... Before his death in 2008, Franz returned to that airfield in Germany where he'd made his emergency landing. It was a civilian airport now, peaceful, filled with tourists and business people, not soldiers. He stood on the runway and remembered that March day in 1945 when he thought his life was over. "I died that day," he said quietly to the journalist accompanying him. The man who believed all the lies, who hated without knowing why, he died. "And I was reborn as someone who understood that our common humanity is stronger than our temporary enmities." Stronger than politics or ideology or national borders, Franz Stigler's story isn't just history. It's not just a feel-good tale from the past. It's a lesson about the long-term power of treating enemies with dignity. Think about it. Those American pilots had every reason to shoot Franz down. They'd lost friends to the Luftwaffe, watched buddies die screaming. They were in the middle of the most brutal war in human history, but they chose a different path. They chose to see a defenseless pilot, not a Nazi enemy. They chose to help him land safely before capturing him. That choice rippled outward like waves from a stone dropped in still water. Franz became a voice for reconciliation. He raised children who grew up believing in German-American friendship. His story influenced how people thought about former enemies. Multiply that by thousands. Every German prisoner who came home with a story of American fairness, of medical care, of simple respect. Each one was a seed planted for the post-war peace. Each one was a voice saying, maybe they're not so different from us. This is what separates sustainable victory from temporary domination. You can defeat enemies through force, through superior firepower and better tactics. But you can only build lasting peace by showing them a better way. By demonstrating through actions, not words, that your values are worth embracing. The Americans understood this instinctively. It wasn't written in some grand strategy document. It flowed from American culture. From the belief that all people have certain rights, that rules matter. That how you treat people in their most vulnerable moments defines who you are. We live in a world of deep divisions, political, cultural, international. It's easy to dehumanize the other side, to reduce complex people to simple enemies. To see only the uniform or the flag and not the human being underneath. Franz's story reminds us what's possible when we refuse to do that. When we choose to see human beings instead of abstractions, when we treat even our adversaries with a baseline of respect, not because they deserve it, but because we're better than our worst impulses. This doesn't mean weakness. The Americans weren't weak. They were winning the war, crushing the Axis with overwhelming force. But they understood that strength includes restraint. That true power means following rules even when you don't have to. That building the future matters as much as winning the present. Maybe more. In our current conflicts, military, political, social, we could use more of that long-term thinking. More willingness to see that today's enemy might be tomorrow's partner. More understanding that how we treat people in defeat determines what kind of world we build in victory. It's not naive, it's strategic. It's smart. Franz's grandson, a German Air Force pilot, now flies alongside American pilots in NATO. Former enemies, now allies, brothers in arms. That's the legacy of treating one powerless enemy pilot with dignity on a March day in 19... That's the power of choosing mercy when you could choose revenge. On March 24th, Franz Stigler climbed into his Messerschmitt expecting to die as an enemy of America. He landed as a prisoner, yes, but also as a man who'd discovered that propaganda was lies. That enemies could be decent. That even in the darkest moments of history, human beings could choose to be better than the worst in themselves. He didn't find the monsters he'd been promised. He found men who believed that even in war there are lines you don't cross. Rules you follow, standards you maintain. That wasn't just American military doctrine, that was American character. And it changed the world, one saved life at a time. One act of mercy at a time. One choice to see the human being behind the enemy uniform. That's how you win not just wars, but peace. That's how you build a better world from the ashes of the worst one. That's how two enemies become brothers. And that echo, that ripple, it still whispers across the years. Reminding us what's possible when we choose to be better.